Let's turn our attention now to what's happening in the Middle East. Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, has arrived in Israel this morning. He is having meetings with Benjamin Netanyahu and other leading figures in Israel, where we are understanding that he is going to be urging the country to show, as Rishi Sunak said in a phone call to Netanyahu yesterday, calm in response to Iran's drone and missile attack at the weekend. Well, let's talk about this now with Jake Wallis-Simons. He's the editor of the Jewish Chronicle. He's also the author of Israelophobia, the newest version of the oldest hatred, and what to do about it. Good morning to you, Jake.
Good morning.
We've seen around the world, we've seen Joe Biden, this bizarre phone call to Netanyahu, take the win. In terms of thankfully the lack of death and destruction as a result of that unprecedented Iranian missile and drone attack at the weekend, thanks to the Iron Dome and indeed, of course, help from allies, including, interestingly, Jordan. But we know there's going to have to be a reaction. I don't think anyone realistically thinks that Iran can launch an assault like that on civilian targets in Israel and that Israel does not respond. What would be an appropriate, but as Rishi Sunak says, calm response to that attack that would perhaps not escalate things even more in the Middle East?
Well, it seems like from Sunak's point of view, and indeed from President Biden's point of view, the correct response would be no response at all. They seem to want the Israelis to play only defense. And of course, the Israelis won't do that because that would establish a new normal under which Iran would do it again and expect the Israelis not to respond. So Israel has to respond. But it needs to keep its allies on board, given that they are calling for restraint, but also it needs to avoid escalating into an all-out war. But most importantly, it needs to enforce a painful deterrent that will prevent Iran from doing this again. And that's a difficult calibration. Get it wrong, and it could trigger a war, but it has options. One option is, for example, to launch some covert strikes that are deniable from within Iran. We know that Mossad's capabilities are extensive in Iran. There are also cyber options as well. But I think that it's more likely that we'll see a strike from Israeli territory into Iran, which will more closely mirror the Iranian aggression and therefore act as a more direct deterrent, or perhaps a combination of all three things. Now, in terms of targets, I think that we could likely expect to see some weapons factories and facilities targeted, particularly ones that have been providing drones and other weapons for Russia to use in Ukraine. I mean, that would be a service to the West as well. It would help to keep the alliance strong. So I think that's quite likely. We might see a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. That's, I think, less likely, but it's a possibility given that they are making rapid progress towards a bomb. And once they are nuclearized, then it's an entire game changer and the world's suddenly a much more dangerous place. Or we could see targeted strikes against individuals, maybe the head of the Revolutionary Guards, his deputy, the commander of the armed forces, and so on.
And there's a big difference, isn't there, between there being civilian and military targets. And it is extraordinary to me that the urge for, to not respond or to respond in a very, very low, very measured way to what was a huge upgrading of the response from Iran. Response to an attack on the compound of their embassy, their consulate in Damascus in Syria, which killed only military targets, to respond but with 300 plus drones and missiles across civilian targets is a completely off the scale response from Iran. And yes, there's been condemnation, but there doesn't seem to be any expectation that Iran should be required to sort of hold back from preventing World War III erupting in the Middle East, but always responsibility on Israel when, of course, there's not a chance in hell that Britain, America, France, or any other Western country would say, oh, you just launched 300 drone and missile attacks on us. That's fine. I don't want to start a war. I won't do anything. We would never hold ourselves to the same standard.
That's right. I mean, the civilian point, I think, is an important one, because aside from the fact that Israel does not intentionally target civilians because it's a democracy with irresponsible armed forces, or an imperfect one in some ways, also the Iranian civilians are really Israel's best asset, because the majority of everyday Iranians loathe the regime, which oppresses them and keeps them under its heel, with its secret police, with its ridiculous and absurd and draconian laws against the hijab and public self-expression and so forth. And most Iranians actually are friends of Israel and support Israel. We see whenever there's an Israeli strike, we see celebrations, muted celebrations, but celebrations nonetheless inside Iran. And so for Israel to attack Iran, Iranian civilians would be to attack their own allies. And one of the reasons that Israeli intelligence operations are so successful in Iran is because they have friends in the Iranian public that help them.
Yes.
So that would be a mistake. But I think that you're right. I mean, you know, the international community emphasizing in public that the Israelis should show restraint is only telegraphing to the Iranians that, look, we've got your back. We've got your back. We're going to hold back the Israelis.
Although I have to say, I was heartened and not a little surprised to see the level of Western support, including actual military support, RAF jets and American jets shooting down some of those drones and missiles over the weekend, because I think the West has been incredibly lily-livered in terms of their support for Israel in this. And again, you know, let's all stop the pretense that this attack by Israel on the Damascus compound was completely and utterly out of the blue and came from nowhere at all. Oh, last time I looked, Iran openly stated by the same government saying that Israel shouldn't respond. They've been saying, you know, Iranian-funded proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthi rebels have been attacking Israel, indeed attacking Western shipping, funded by Iran. You know, it's an absolute nonsense, isn't it? What do you make of sanctions, though? Because one of the things the Western governments are looking at now, we've got the G7 meeting on the island of Capri later today as well, where, you know, there's going to actually be, you know, talk about more sanctions on Iran in terms of selling oil and the like. Is that likely to work, given the sort of, let's face it, the axis of evil that is going along in the world with Russia, Iran, China and other countries that are just fighting against Western values and democracy? Is there any chance that sanctions could seriously damage and undermine the Iranian regime?
Well, I have two thoughts on that. The first is that the Americans in particular have been failing to enforce their own existing sanctions, willfully evading their own sanctions legislation in order to give millions of dollars to the Iranians. In the run-up to October the 7th, America released $16 billion in frozen sanctions money to the Iranians as a sweetener to try to appease them so that they wouldn't launch any attacks and that it would come to the negotiating table and come to a nuclear agreement. And even since October the 7th, the Americans have released $10 billion to the Iranians. And that's despite their own sanctions. They've been also turning a blind eye to oil sanctions, allowing Iran to hit 2 million barrels a day in sales to China without the Americans raising any objections at all, and other ways. And so, you know, enforcing the existing sanctions would be a good start. But I think overall, in terms of the sanctions that Rishi Sunak has been proposing, rather than banning the Iranian terror regime in Britain, trying to stop a fanatic with sanctions is a bit like trying to stop a knife man with a fine. If somebody's coming to stab you to death, saying that you're going to fine him isn't really going to help. We're dealing with a regime that is powered by a fanatical ideology that is lusting after a third world war in order to trigger the apocalypse. It believes in a prophecy of this messianic figure called the Mahdi coming out of invisibility in an apocalyptic scenario and leading the Islamic world to victory over the whole world, heralding a kind of end times. That's what it believes and that's what it wants. Stopping them with sanctions ain't going to work.
Really good to talk to you. Jake Wallis-Simons, thank you very much indeed, editor of the Jewish Chronicle.